Hi everybody, Niels from Reiza Studios here with a screen here that seems to be designed solely for the purpose of causing maximum confusion. What we'll talk about today is the tire model that we use in game Stock Car Extreme and how it enables us to relatively easily and quickly create a tire that's infinitely adjustable and quite complex, even though our model is sometimes said to be on the sort of outdated side. So here is sort of in defense of the model and a look behind the scenes of what goes on creating a tire. The tire we have here is a generic one. It's not one from any of our cars, but it's just a showcase of to do some stuff with in this video. So you may have seen the tire model, kind of the file from our factor, for example, or one of our cars, and it has a lot of numbers here, but what do these actually do and how does it all work? Well, initially there's this curve here, which is just a bunch of numbers, and effectively curves have a build-up part, basically, where it starts at 0 and reaches the maximum, and then a part where it drops off, and that's sometimes considered to be, oh, that's the tire model, it just sort of follows a curve and that's it. But it's a lot more complex than that. For starters, we have a lot of adjustability in these curves. Anything between 0 and 1 here, just an infinite number of different shapes, which in reality are the result of the construction of the tire and how the materials and plies and belts and everything are hugely complex. But we input sort of the result of that straight away. And then the drop-off as well has various shapes and scales as well, as we'll see later. So this is sort of a tire brewster witchcraft thing where the base curve for the tire is chosen. Now the tire curve can be different from lateral, which is when the tire is cornering, and longitudinal when it's braking or accelerating. And that already gives us an infinite number of curves that we can apply differently for cornering and braking and stuff like that. So yes, it's a curve, but it's only the start. And for example, looking at the front tire here, this curve, we see lateral behavior, so that's cornering basically, how the grip grows as the slip angle here increases. So in this case, the maximum at high loads, this top line is a very high vertical download, the tire is pressing on the road quite hard. We are somewhere over 9 degrees where we reach our maximum grip. So here is already some stuff going on. So this initial curve I can change, as we saw on the previous sheet on the spreadsheet, to a more round shape or a more straight shape, and that's all infinitely adjustable, as you can see. But I can also change how the tire load, which increases as the lines go up, how that affects things. So perhaps this tire is a lot stiffer. I can change these parameters here and make it stiffer, and now it's these only 7 degrees. Or it's very load sensitive here, so I can increase it as load increases, and then you can see initially it starts at 5, but then it grows a lot. All things that in reality are with the complex construction of the tire and all sorts of super advanced stuff, but this model gives us lots of flexibility, and it's up to us if we decide that the tire is a certain era or construction, that we can choose the curve that we want with the peak slip angles that we want, and that's all very flexible. However, these curves here aren't static, and that's the main thing that I want to explain with this video. For example, if we change the speed at, oh sorry, bit over the top. If we stand still, there is a certain amount of grip, but if we go 300 kilometers an hour, there's less grip. So we can have speed as an influencing factor, which is quite small here because this is meant to be a modern radial tire, but perhaps an older era tire will suffer from this effect more, and we can change that effect differently from front and rear tire if we desire. So if the tire construction front to rear is different and we feel this method or era of tire will suffer from that more, if the tire is bigger, for example, we can do that. Now pressure is another very interesting thing. Running too low pressure, if you look at these curves again, you can see that the top one goes down, but the lower one goes up slightly. And that means that the pressure has a load sensitive effect on the situation, which is realistic and quite sophisticated, and yeah, it's a proper way of doing it as far as I'm aware. Camber as well, for example, adds is a pretty realistic interpretation. Again, as far as my knowledge goes, it shifts the curves to the left and increases the grip a little bit. Basically, if now we have 0 camber, you see everything starts at 0, and then we add, let's say, a whole bunch of camber, 5 degrees. You see that initially it starts at a certain lateral force. Camber adds grip without slip angle, basically, but the greater the slip angle becomes, the less effect the camber has, which is, to my knowledge, again, that's how camber works. And if we zoom out a little bit, you can see, let's go extreme here at 90. If we have 0 camber, it changes mainly the first part here of the curve, because, as I said, as slip angle grows, camber doesn't like it, so its effect is lost. And that's, to my knowledge, quite correct. And if we look here at 24 degrees, for example, now with a whole bunch of camber, it barely changes. But if we look at the maximum area here, it has quite a big effect. So camber has its most effect initially here without slip angle, and then the effect is reduced, and that seems to be a pretty good way of dealing with it. Now we can change the amount of effect that the camber has and which angles have certain effects quite easily, and gives us a lot of flexibility in that regard. Again, front and rear tires can be quite different in this behavior as well. So we've seen how I changed the initial curve, but also the drop-off curve, I haven't shown that yet, can be adjusted here. So the adjustability we have in these curves, and don't forget, all the time affected by the speed, the camber, the pressure, the temperature, and even the wear. Let's wear out the front tire by having 50% wear, then whoops, we've lost a lot of grip there. So everything we have here is already visible and comparable between the tires, and we know this before driving a lap. We know exactly what the effect will be. Another interesting thing is looking sort of at, a tire is part of the car. So when you design a car, you want to know how the tires affect it, and the rear tires are often different than the front tires. So it's not just a matter of creating the tire, a front tire and a rear tire. You constantly want to know how the front and the rear relate to each other. And that's, for example, in this chart here. I won't go into too much detail, but it shows you the friction coefficient of the tires versus the vertical load again. It's always load. Load is a very important thing to plot in the tire model. And you can see that the rear tire is the red one and the front tire is the blue line here. That in this case we made the rear tire bigger and better, so it has more grip. This line is higher. But good as that may seem, it's interesting to plot the difference between the front and the rear tire. So you can design, for example, in this line, the difference between these two lines, that the difference between the front and the rear tire increases as the tire load increases. Now this could be just a thing that you design or have data for, but it's telling us that at 4000 Newton the rear tire in these conditions has about 6% more grip than the front tire. And again, everything changes constantly. So what happens if the front tire is slightly underinflated? You can see this curve change quite a bit. And you can imagine that the front to rear tire grip differences are quite important in the balance of the car. So we know in our model here in the spreadsheet exactly how running a little bit of pressure will change the front rear tire relationship. So that gives us a lot of insight already without having sort of to guess anything. We know exactly what happens, and that's the beauty of this model. It's yeah, some people call it simple, but you've seen right by now that it isn't. It's quite complex, even though it may start with sort of a curve. It's adjusted real time based on so many parameters that it's at the end of the day pretty complex and sometimes goes over my head. And now that's not necessarily saying a lot, but it is important that the people who work with the model have that the model fits the brain of the people working with it. And in my case, this is sort of a decent match, because I feel I understand somewhat what happens here. And when I change something, I think I have a reasonable idea of why and how. And this model may seem a little on the simple side compared to some of the newer models, but it gives us a very goal-driven, target aiming, sort of results-driven tire model with a lot of curves and things to plot here that tell us what the tire will do. So I think I've went on for quite long already and give you some insight. I will do a couple more things. So for example, looking at, there we are, the temperature, for example. Currently the front and the rear tire have sort of the same temperature curve, so at low temperature there is less grip than 1, so that's the grip multiplier basically. And then there's a certain optimum temperature here at 80 degrees, and then if you run too hot it drops off again. But perhaps the rear tire responds differently. Perhaps it has a lower optimum temperature or a higher one. Let's make it 100, for example. Now you can see that the rear tire curve differs for the front, and perhaps the effect of running it too hot is worse, or running it too cold is worse. So relatively simple, but now we have different temperature behavior, and temperature changes all the time based on how you drive it, and it's far and far away from that initial curve that we draw. So that's let's go back to that again. A pretty complex, in-depth look at the situation, and we may do more of these videos in the future. But let's say, alright, this is all good and well. What do you do if you have data for a car? And that's where the power of the model comes in. If I may look for the file. Yes, there it is. So here is the same spreadsheet again. And now we had some real data. And data is difficult with tires. It's hard to trust, and I've made a document about it before, explaining how real tire data comes about and what sort of tolerances are on it. But let's say you've got tire data and you're sure that it's likely to be correct. You can see that here is a overlay, sort of trying to get a fairly pixel perfect overlay here, which is never exact, but it's kind of there, with the real data and our sim data. And you can see that these lines overlay almost perfectly regarding the slip angle and the behavior. Also very importantly here is the size of the tire. So it grows, the tire grows as your car speed increases, which is important with downforce, for example. Downforce gets a lot more as speed increases, and it helps that if the tire sort of expands, that it sort of reduces the need for stiff springs, because the tire sort of grows effectively. And this radius behavior is important because ride height can affect the balance of the car a lot, especially with aero sensitive cars. So here this is a real data, and here you can see at 3 loads, again always the vertical loads, we have the real data, which is the slightly curved line, and our model here, which is more of a straight line, but you can see it fits quite well. So in this case the tire expansion versus speed matches the real data, and this is all just, you know, half an hour of tweaking. And in reality, and with more modern physical tire models, the tire expansion might be a function of its construction and plies and nylon and belts and everything. But in order to match this data, you have to change the construction of the tire. But changing the construction will also affect these curves, and it will affect everything basically. And while our model might be seen as more simple, it gives us more separate control over the important parameters. So we can change this speed sensitivity, speed radius increase, without worrying that our base curves here change. So it's a lot more flexible in that regard, and it's very quick for us to work with. And here's another overlay of the cornering stiffness, which I won't go into now, but you can see it's another big match there. So this model allows us to copy real data if we trust it, or use our experience and sort of our tire as a part of the whole car, comparing it front and rear and how it affects the handling of the car in a very quick way, in a very sort of detailed way, with a lot of things that we can plot and look at, and that creates sort of a goal-driven tire that works pretty much straight away pretty well, and gives us a lot of flexibility in making small adjustments and getting it to feel just right. And it's not a physical tire model, it's relatively simple with a curve system, but with so many infinite things happening all the time that I think by now you're hopefully somewhat impressed that how well this model is, even though it's not the newest. It's still a way to do it that, in my opinion and in our opinion, works very well and gives us very good results. Thank you for watching. I hope you stayed awake and that your eyes are still sort of pointing forward and aren't really too crossed up. And we'll see you later. Bye bye.